When aspiring writers talk about A Song of Ice and Fire, the conversation almost always drifts toward the obvious. People praise the political intrigue, the dragons, the unpredictable deaths, or the sheer complexity of George R. R. Martin's world. Those elements certainly deserve recognition, but focusing on them alone misses the real reason these novels have influenced an entire generation of writers. Martin didn't revolutionize fantasy because he invented a new kind of magic system or because he was willing to kill beloved characters. Neither of those ideas were particularly new. Fantasy literature had already experimented with morally gray protagonists, sprawling worlds, and tragic endings decades before A Game of Thrones was published. What Martin accomplished was something far more difficult. He created a world that behaves as though it exists independently of the story being told. The characters aren't moving through a carefully designed plot. They're struggling to survive inside a living civilization that refuses to bend itself around them. Kings make disastrous decisions because of pride. Noble houses crumble under the weight of generations-old grudges. Entire wars begin over choices that once seemed insignificant. By the time readers reach the final page of each novel, they aren't remembering isolated scenes. They're remembering an entire history. That distinction is important because it's also where many aspiring novelists go wrong. It's surprisingly easy to write an exciting plot. It's much harder to convince readers that the plot is simply one chapter in a much larger world. Readers can sense the difference almost instinctively. One feels like a story that exists for their entertainment. The other feels like a place that would continue existing whether they were reading it or not. As someone currently writing a fantasy series, I've found myself returning to Martin's novels for exactly that reason. Not to imitate his world or his characters, but to study the craftsmanship hidden beneath them. Every reread reveals another decision that seems invisible at first glance, but completely transforms the reading experience. The more closely you examine his work, the more you realize that many of his greatest strengths have very little to do with fantasy at all. They're lessons about storytelling itself. One of the most common pieces of advice given to fantasy writers is to build a detailed world. Unfortunately, that advice is often misunderstood. Writers spend months creating maps, inventing religions, designing currencies, and documenting centuries of fictional history, only to discover that none of it actually makes the novel feel alive. The problem isn't a lack of world building. The problem is confusing information with history. Martin understands that readers don't care how much research you've done unless they can feel its influence on the present. Westeros isn't believable because it has thousands of years of recorded history. It's believable because every generation continues carrying the consequences of that history. Consider the relationship between the North and the Iron Throne. Long before the first chapter begins, resentment has already accumulated through generations of political compromise, shifting loyalties, and cultural differences. Ned Stark doesn't simply serve Robert Baratheon because the story requires it. Their friendship was forged during Robert's rebellion, a conflict that itself grew from events stretching back years before either man ever wore a crown. Likewise, the hatred between the Lannisters and the Martells isn't introduced as a convenient subplot. It grows naturally from the murder of Elia Martell and her children during the fall of King's Landing, an atrocity that continues shaping political alliances decades later. Notice what Martin isn't doing. He doesn't stop the narrative to deliver lengthy history lectures every time these events become relevant. Instead, the past quietly leaks into the present through conversations, insults, family traditions, songs, ruined castles, and old grievances. Characters reference historical events the same way real people reference their own history, with the assumption that everyone around them already understands what they're talking about. That single decision changes everything. Imagine walking into an old family gathering. Nobody sits you down to explain 20 years of arguments between relatives. You gradually piece the story together through awkward silences, inside jokes, and lingering resentment. Martin approaches world building the same way. Readers become historians rather than students. That's a far more engaging experience than simply being handed an encyclopedia. World building isn't about answering every question. It's about making readers believe there are answers waiting to be discovered. One of the oldest debates among writers asks whether stories should begin with plot or character. Martin's novels don't provide a simple answer, but they do demonstrate which of the two ultimately matters more. Many fantasy novels begin with an extraordinary event that forces ordinary people into adventure. A prophecy appears. A magical artifact is discovered. A dark lord returns. The external conflict pushes the characters forward. A Song of Ice and Fire certainly contains massive political upheaval, ancient magic, and existential threats. But none of those elements would matter if the characters responded differently. In Martin's hands, plot is almost always the consequence of personality. Take Eddard Stark. It's tempting to describe Ned as the honorable protagonist whose goodness leads to tragedy. That's true, but it's also incomplete. Ned doesn't die simply because he's honorable. He dies because his understanding of honor was shaped by a lifetime of experiences in the North, by his friendship with Robert, by the promises he made to his sister, and by the moral framework he inherited from his father. Every decision he makes in King's Landing emerges logically from that foundation, even when readers desperately wish he would choose differently. A lesser novel would force Ned to make foolish decisions simply to move the story toward its climax. Martin never does that. Instead, he allows Ned to remain entirely consistent with his character, even when that consistency becomes fatal. The same principle appears everywhere else in the series. The War of the Five Kings isn't merely a conflict over succession. It's the inevitable collision of dozens of personalities whose ambitions, fears, loyalties, and insecurities refuse to coexist peacefully. Robb Stark marries Jane Westerling because he's trying to act with honor after believing he compromised her reputation. Catelyn frees Jaime because she's a grieving mother, willing to gamble everything for the chance of saving her daughters. Theon betrays Winterfell because his desperate need for belonging overwhelms his better judgment. None of these choices exist because Martin needed another twist. They exist because, given everything we know about these people, they could never have acted any other way. That distinction is one of the most valuable lessons any novelist can learn. Readers don't remember characters because they survived spectacular adventures. They remember them because, when confronted with impossible decisions, those characters reveal exactly who they are. Sometimes the most effective way to strengthen your plot isn't by inventing another dramatic event. It's by understanding your protagonist well enough that the next event becomes unavoidable. One of the laziest criticisms directed at A Song of Ice and Fire is that it's famous simply because anyone can die. While technically true, that observation completely misunderstands why Martin's shocking moments work. Killing characters is easy. Making those deaths feel inevitable is extraordinarily difficult. The Red Wedding wasn't devastating because readers lost beloved characters. It was devastating because every step leading toward that massacre had already been placed on the board long before the doors of the twins were ever closed. Robb Stark breaks his marriage alliance with House Frey. Walder Frey values pride above almost everything else. Rose Bolton quietly grows dissatisfied with Robb's leadership while calculating where true power is shifting. Tywin Lannister recognizes that victory through diplomacy is cheaper than victory through battle. Individually, none of these developments seem extraordinary. Together, they create a catastrophe that feels horrifying precisely because it makes perfect sense. The same principle governs nearly every major turning point throughout the series. Jaime loses his sword hand not simply to shock readers, but to dismantle the very identity he had built around himself. Tyrion's trial isn't merely another courtroom drama. It's the inevitable culmination of a lifetime spent being blamed for crimes he didn't commit. Even Daenerys' growing willingness to use fear as a political weapon develops gradually across multiple books, allowing readers to watch idealism slowly collide with absolute power. Martin rarely asks, "How can I surprise my audience?" Instead, he asks a far more interesting question. If every character remains true to themselves, what is the natural consequence of putting these people together? That mindset fundamentally changes how stories are constructed. Many writers chase unpredictability because they're afraid readers will guess the ending. Martin proves that predictability isn't the real enemy. Artificiality is. Readers don't resent seeing a tragedy coming. They resent realizing it only happened because the author forced it to happen. The greatest plot twists often feel obvious in retrospect because the clues were always there. The author simply trusted readers to recognize them too late, and that's a lesson worth carrying into any genre.
The three lessons we've explored so far all point toward the same philosophy of storytelling. Martin doesn't create memorable novels because his world is large, because his plot is unpredictable, or because he's willing to kill important characters. Those are merely the visible results of something much deeper. His stories work because every element serves the illusion that the world exists independently of the narrative. History shapes the present, character shapes the plot, consequences shape the future. Nothing exists simply because the author decided it should. That's a far more valuable lesson than any piece of writing advice that promises a shortcut to better storytelling. It's also why studying A Song of Ice and Fire remains worthwhile even for writers who have no intention of writing fantasy. Replace castles with corporations, dragons with technology, or medieval kingdoms with modern cities, and the underlying principles remain exactly the same. Great stories don't emerge from genre. They emerge from believable people living in believable worlds, making believable decisions whose consequences cannot be escaped. Of course, these are only a few of the techniques hidden beneath Martin's prose. Some of his most valuable lessons aren't about world building or plot at all. They're about viewpoint, exposition, pacing, dialogue, and the subtle craft that keeps readers turning pages without ever noticing the machinery beneath the story. We'll dive into those in part 2.